hopefully you have an awareness that one of the most important things that the body has to do, obviously, is maintain homeostasis. And one of the more important parameters to maintain homeostasis for is pH. Because if you change the concentration of hydrogen ions in a solution, right, and you alter the pH, we certainly know that that affects the folding of proteins, the structure of proteins, and other kinds of conditions. And as soon as you start altering structures of proteins, you're going to be altering affinities and things like that, and their ability to do their job. And especially if they're enzymes, you're not going to catalyze reactions as well, whatever. So pH balance is very important. Different body compartments, right, where there's fluid, have different optimal levels of pH. Generally speaking, pH balance, if we think of extracellular fluid, pH balance is usually slightly basic. Certainly for blood plasma, we would expect a pH somewhere in the neighborhood of 7.4 or so to be an optimal pH level. Obviously that can vary a little bit, but that is slightly basic. Other compartments, right, need to be very acidic, like gastric juice. Other secretions are basic, like pancreatic juice and seminal fluid. It really depends on where we are. The normal pH, like we said, about blood plasma, we're looking at somewhere right around 7.4. And it is important to really keep that closely regulated. You'll notice there that if we say a normal pH between 7.38 and 7.42, that's pretty tight, right? I mean, that's not a large room for error there. If you do change the pH of body fluids, especially blood, that can have, implications for the rest of the body. If the pH drops in the body fluid, right, we call that acidosis. If the pH comes above the optimal, that would be called alkalosis. Okay. Now, depending upon where we are in the body, the extent of how much the pH changes and what drastic impacts that will have depends on where we are. But in general, right, it does affect pretty drastically the nervous system because it interferes with, you can imagine pH and hydrogen balance are going to interfere with electrical charges across membranes. And electrical charges across membrane are what we use for potentials, right? An action potential and graded potentials, and whether things are depolarized or hyperpolarized depends on charges across membranes. Okay. Generally speaking, under acidic conditions, neurons become less excitable, and that leads to what we call central nervous system depression. So if you have a lot of hydrogen ions floating around in extracellular fluid, right, you can imagine that outside of cells we've got an excess of plus charges, right? So our resting potential, if you will, is much lower. So it takes us further away from threshold. On the other hand, if you're alkaline, right, there's less positive charges outside the membrane, and you're closer to threshold, and the neurons will become hyperexcitable, right? Because you're looking at a situation where in the ECF and the ICF, right, we said we had at resting potential that kind of scenario, right, where we had a lot of negative charges on the inside due to dissolved organics and things like that, and a lot of positives on the outside. Well, if you increase hydrogen ions out here, this becomes more positive. So you're further away from threshold, right, and you're going to make the neurons less excitable. And that would lead to total overall CNS depression, things like that. On the other hand, if you have fewer hydrogens, so you're more basic, that would make it closer to threshold, fewer pluses outside here, closer to threshold and hyperexcited. So you would have a difficult time if pH is not balanced at just regulating all of these physiological functions that require the nervous system to be, help us regulate. So because of that, we need to have some ways to monitor pH and keep it within these normal ranges. Okay? So obviously, the body has we're more likely to encounter this phenomenon here than we are alkalosis. Most of the food that you ingest, the fluids that you ingest, are acidic. The stuff you produce inside of your body are all organic acids, right? So you're much more likely, if you come out of balance, if this is balance right here, you're much more likely to enter a state of acidosis rather than alkalosis. Okay? So our body actually has, because of that, we have more ways to compensate for this than we do to compensate for this. Alkalosis can occur, but it's not real common. Okay? Now, in order to compensate for this, if we become too acidic or if we become too basic, we need mechanisms that allow us to compensate for this. So the compensation for either of these two properties is by one of two mechanisms. We can have respiratory compensation. This accounts actually for most of it. It's the quickest. Okay? And we can have urinary compensation or renal compensation. So let's call it renal. So these are the two mechanisms by which we can help return the body back to normal. So if we think about this here, we're looking at, let's do it this way.